Settle down. That's it. Calm. Good. Right. Okay, let's go on with this. Resurrection, the evidence. Right, let's get stuck into this. So, excuse me. Pardon me. Thank you. To start a look at evidence for the resurrection, I'd like to return to that list of events from the historian E.P. Sanders' book, The Historical Figure of Jesus. You'll remember that from earlier we went through a list of what Sanders referred to as a list of secure facts about the life and death of Jesus and its aftermath. As I said, these are historical facts that the majority of today's historians are agreed actually happened before and after Jesus' death. Let me repeat the last few on that list. So, about the year 30 or 33 AD, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area. He had a final meal with the disciples. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest. And he was executed in the orders of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. Then Sanders goes on to provide what he refers to as a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. The disciples first fled. The disciples saw Jesus, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed he would return to found the kingdom. And they have formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. So I guess the purpose of the remainder of this evening is to focus on that third last bullet point. Today's historians, both Christian and non-Christian, are agreed that something happened to convince the disciples they had seen Jesus after his death. So, what did they see? Well, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Our own personal experience, our medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics all tell us that people just don't come back to life again after they die. So, we might think, surely there's some other explanation. Well, what we'll do now is look at some of the more common alternative explanations and see how they sit with the evidence we have for what happened. So, it would have been pretty easy to appear to your disciples after your death if he didn't die in the first place. So, was Jesus really executed? Could he have been taken down off the cross before he died, then revived later? At first glance, that doesn't look too implausible. We've all heard of people who have been pronounced dead, then to everyone's surprise, revived some hours or days later in a mortuary or hospital. Like this fellow on the screen here. That's a chap called Walter Williams. He died in Alabama in 2014. He was on that gurney in a mortuary with that body bag over the top of him, and the mortician heard a scratching under the bag. The mortician unzipped the bag, and there's Walter Williams recovering in hospital. So if that kind of thing can happen today, well, what about 2,000 years ago when medical knowledge was more primitive? Could the Romans who executed Jesus have just made a mistake? Alternatively, what if the whole thing was faked? Was the crucifixion somehow staged managed as some form of diversion to allow Jesus to escape? Well, in response, consider the following. Historians and archaeologists can tell us quite a lot about Roman torture and execution techniques. I won't go into the gory details here. There are plenty of internet sites, books, and television programs on that very subject if you're interested. But what our knowledge of Roman torture and execution tells us is that it was very, very unlikely that anyone survived a Roman crucifixion. Now, we know of one or two other examples from other sources that it could happen, but it was a very, very rare occurrence. Now, even if Jesus could have been taken down before he died and the nails taken out of his wrists and feet, He wouldn't have been able to walk, and he certainly wouldn't have been able to use his hands. It's very unlikely he would have made a full recovery. Also, he wasn't executed by amateurs. Roman soldiers did the job. Now, they might not have had 21st century medical knowledge, but they knew exactly how to kill somebody. That's what they were trained to do. They were professional career killers. Also, he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. One argument goes that perhaps the soldiers had been bribed by persons unknown not to kill Jesus. Instead, they were somehow to stage manage a fake execution. Now, firstly, that would have been pretty difficult, as it was a public crucifixion, as all crucifixions were. That was the whole point, to act as a warning to others not to disturb the Roman order. Secondly, if that had been found out, the soldiers would have disobeyed the direct command from the Roman ruler of Judea. A slow and painful death would have been the inevitable result. Also, the sources of evidence we've got all agree that Jesus was tortured and flogged before he was crucified. So, in short, just suppose he was able to survive the crucifixion. Just suppose there was some plot to get him off the cross. What kind of condition would he have been in? Hardly an impressive sight for the disciples a few days later. Hardly an inspiration for the disciples then to go and spread the message of a risen Christ triumphing over death throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. So, given what I've said, it's highly unlikely that Jesus survived his crucifixion. It's also highly unlikely the whole thing was stage managed either. However, as you may be aware, the fake crucifixion theory has had some popular currency in the last few years. If you've read the book or seen the film of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, you'll know that one theory is that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Instead, he escapes to southern France along with his wife, Mary Magdalene. In southern France, their children intermarry with the Merovingians, thus creating a holy bloodline the Catholic Church has been trying to suppress ever since. Now, that theory is based on an earlier book by Bagent Lee and Lincoln called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. There it is up in the top right-hand corner. We could spend some time this evening looking at the pros and cons of this. However, I think this will be going over ground well covered in the numerous books and articles written on the subject currently available. Instead, I think I can say one thing. This theory is just that, a theory. Whilst there are historically factual elements to the theory, other facts are ignored. There's also a large amount of speculation required to arrive at the conclusions the books and film make. If this is an area of interest to you, read the book, read the articles on the internet about the subject, and I think a review of these items I think you'll find why there is no serious takers amongst the overwhelming majority of today's historians for this theory. So it looks most likely he was executed. Well, what happened to his dead body? Now, this is important to consider. Clearly, it would have been difficult to explain Jesus being alive after his death if his corpse was still in the tomb. Gospel account is he was executed, prepared for burial, placed in a rock cave tomb. On the third day after his death, some of his female followers went to the tomb. They found the tomb open and the body missing. As I mentioned earlier, although some of the details of the empty tomb seems to vary between the Gospels, some of the event is present in all four Gospels. Clearly, early Christians believed that his body had disappeared from earth so that he could come back alive again to his followers. However, are there any other explanations why his body might have been missing? Well, perhaps the best way of looking at this is to look for a motive. Who could have removed the body from the tomb, and what would their motive be for doing so? Well, I guess the Romans could have, and the Romans' main concern was maintaining order in Jerusalem. Their motivation for executing Jesus, as we've seen, was in direct response to the disturbance Jesus had created in the temple area. That disturbance created the unrest the Romans were always seeking to avoid in this very volatile part of their empire. Now, Jesus had some very devoted followers. Perhaps the Romans were concerned that leaving Jesus' body in the tomb, it would become a shrine to Jesus and a focal point for further unrest. Now, this line of thought does have some modern parallels. For example, at the end of the Second World War, the Russian army discovered Hitler's dead body in his burned-out bunker in Berlin. However, they took the body and destroyed it completely so that it could not be buried. Their concern was that Hitler's grave would become a focal point for Nazi sympathizers in the future. However, what undermines that theory is that very shortly after Jesus' death, his followers are going around saying he's risen from the dead. They're making a nuisance of themselves and causing the very disorder the Romans were trying to avoid. Indeed, the Romans then spent the next 300-odd years trying to suppress the disorder that developed throughout the empire as a result of this one event. So, to nip it all in the bud, to stop it all getting out of hand, if the Romans had taken Jesus' body, well, would they not have produced it? Now, a common fate, as you heard in the first half, for corpses of crucifixion victims was they were thrown in the municipal rubbish dump outside Jerusalem where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. If that's what the Romans had done with the body, well, they might not have had it to produce. However, it had been a relatively simple thing to publicly state this is what they'd done with the body. However, we've got no direct evidence or even hints of evidence that anything like this actually happened. So I think we have to conclude it's unlikely that the Romans were responsible for the empty tomb. Well, what about the Jewish authorities? Well, their motive for taking the body and the counter-arguments are kind of similar to the Romans. What about the disciples? Would they have a motive? Also, I think this would look to be unlikely. I personally can't think of a motive that they might have for doing that. Also, the disciples believed that Jesus was raised from the dead and were prepared to die for that belief. Frankly, in most cases, they did die for that belief. If they had taken the body, why then would they make up a raised from the dead story and then be prepared to die in defense of it? Just doesn't make any sense. Okay, what about grave robbers? Well, to me, the idea of the grave robber stole Jesus' body looks like more of a possibility. Grave robbing did occur at that time. Robbers were usually looking for the valuable goods, sometimes buried with a body. In fewer cases, they were looking for the body itself or body parts for use in magic rituals. Okay, was there anything to steal? Well, the synoptic Gospels, that's the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, mention that Jesus' body was wrapped in a linen cloth. No grave goods are mentioned. Grave robbers usually steal the goods buried with a body, not the decomposing body itself. Now, John's Gospel mentions about 34 kilograms of myrrh and aloes, which were wrapped in the linen cloth round Jesus' body. Now, that would have been worth stealing. However, John's Gospel also tells us that Jesus' grave clothes were in the tomb with the burial cloth neatly folded when the disciples entered the tomb and found Jesus' body missing. Now, that doesn't fit with the grave robbing theory. If you were robbing a grave of spices wrapped tightly into the linen binding round a dead body, it would make sense to take the body somewhere else, unwrap it, and take the spices, or to unwrap it in the tomb and take the spices. In the first scenario, there would, of course, be no body or grave clothes in the tomb. In the second scenario, the grave clothes and the body would still be in the tomb. Neither of those are things that are described in John's Gospel. Now, as I said, we know from a few Roman and Greek sources that human bodies or body parts were sometimes used in magic rituals around the Roman Empire. However, this practice wasn't rife, and we've no evidence this occurred within the Jewish part of the Roman Empire. Indeed, Jews would find this kind of behavior abhorrent. This burial occurred in Jerusalem, the most Jewish of Jewish towns and cities. This makes the concept of a stolen body for the purposes of magic even less likely than if the burial had occurred in, say, Athens or Rome or Alexandria or somewhere like that. So nobody seems to have a particularly strong motive for either taking the body or keeping it a secret if they had. Now, I think one final point worth making on this subject. The disciples of Jesus are the founders of what we know as Christianity. After the resurrection, they didn't go to some obscure place miles away from where it all happened to preach about the resurrection. No, they came back to Jerusalem, the very place of Jesus' execution and tomb. Now, fundamental to their preaching was the empty tomb of Jesus. If this preaching had been false, it would have been clearly evident to the people of Jerusalem. Some people would be bound to know where Jesus' tomb was and or what happened to his body. Indeed, he was buried in the tomb of a prominent member of the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin. That is Joseph of Arimathea. So somebody would have been bound to know where Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was. So in conclusion, I suppose we can't say there's any concrete evidence to demonstrate that Jesus' body left earth as the disciples claimed. However, what is clearer is that his body disappeared, and that those with a vested interest in claiming it was still on earth, that is the Romans and the temple authorities, couldn't prove that it actually was. Okay, was Jesus seen alive? At the start of this half of the evening, I mentioned E.P. Sanders' secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As we saw, Sanders says this because historians are of the majority view that Jesus' disciples saw him after his death. What historians, I guess, are less certain about is the in what sense part of that statement. Okay, what do the letters of Paul and the Gospels say about the appearance events? Well, there's more than one appearance event described. There's actually 11 separate and distinct appearance events in the Gospels and letters of Paul. These happen to individuals, groups of people, and in one case, 500 people. They happen over a period of 40 days after Jesus' death, with the exception of his appearance to Paul, which happened much, much later. The Gospels are clear that Jesus was with them physically. He could eat, drink, cook, be touched, and be conversed with. But he could disappear and appear at will. Also, the people that see him sometimes don't seem to immediately recognize the person they're with as Jesus. Now, as I said already, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Our medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics, our own personal experience all tell us that people just don't come back to life after they die. So, are there any other possible explanations for what the disciples saw other than the risen Christ? Well, did they see a ghost? I think for us in the rational 21st century, that's probably a bit as difficult to grasp as seeing the resurrected Jesus. However, the descriptions of a physical Jesus that could eat, drink, and be touched doesn't sound like a spectral appearance. So were they subject to some form of hysteria? Now, the followers of Jesus would have been very distraught after his death. That can make people a bit irrational and unstable. Is it possible that seeing Jesus alive again was all in their mind, some sort of mass hallucination, some sort of fevered imagination, some sort of wish fulfillment? Well, in response to that, our knowledge of psychology tells us that hallucinations are individual occurrences. They can't happen to groups of people at the same time. I could be standing up here having a hallucination. I'm not, by the way. But I could be. But you couldn't have it. It's all mine, my hallucination. You're not seeing it. You can't see it. It's impossible. So, you can put the word mass and hallucination next to each other in a sentence and get the phrase mass hallucination. It can exist in a sentence. It can't exist in real life. Now, having said that, you can just about imagine a situation where a small group of people grieving in a room together might work themselves up into some kind of emotional frenzy. They were all able to convince each other they saw the person they were grieving over. Could any of the appearance events fit with something like that? Well, if I'm honest, the circumstances of one or two could. Although, if I'm also honest, there's nothing in the sources hinting that anything like this actually happened. For the rest, the actual appearance descriptions in the Gospels just don't fit with some sort of hysterical event. For example, two disciples are walking to a village called Emmaus in broad daylight. They're chatting when suddenly Jesus appears with them. The disciples are out catching fish on the Sea of Galilee. As they come ashore, Jesus is waiting for them and has cooked breakfast for them. In another, Jesus appears to more than 500 people at the same time. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are 11 separate appearance events in the documentary evidence we've got. When these are studied and dissected, there's little or no evidence to suggest that hysteria played a part in the appearance events experienced by the disciples. Okay, I should have probably put that up. Okay, so did the disciples just make it all up? That's another explanation, potential explanation. As I mentioned before, nearly all the disciples met violent deaths proclaiming Jesus as the risen Son of God. Frankly, they wouldn't have done that if they'd made the whole thing up. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, today's historians, that's Christian historians and non-Christian historians, specializing in first century Near Eastern history, are of the majority view that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. So in what sense did they see Jesus? Well, it's unlikely they saw a ghost. It's unlikely they suffered some form of hysterical event. It's unlikely they made it all up. As I've said a few times, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Pretty implausible. Just doesn't happen. But historians tell us that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. We've looked at various explanations for this. By deduction, it would look like the least unlikely explanation is they actually saw Jesus alive after his death. By deduction, the other explanations look even more implausible than that. Okay. So, analysis of the evidence we've looked at so far this evening points to the resurrection being an actual historical event. However, is there any other evidence we should consider? Well, I think the answer is a clear yes. Consider the following. Let's cover this one again. Disciples died for the belief. Now, we've touched on this a few minutes ago. Let's consider this in a bit more detail. Now, you might say, so what? You might say countless people have died for their beliefs since the disciples. Excuse me. For thousands of years, people have been enthusiastically dying for what they sincerely believe in. From Emily Davison, the suffragette, to Northern Ireland's Bobby Sands, to the suicide bombers of Iraq, Israel, and Afghanistan, to the terrorists involved in the London tube bombings, to the Jews of the Spanish Inquisition. These are just a few of the countless numbers of people who've died for their sincerely held beliefs since the disciples. However, there's one key difference with the disciples. Disciples sincerely believed that Jesus had died and that they had personally met him after his death. They sincerely believed they had personally conversed with him, eaten with him, and touched him, and were prepared to die for that belief. What they weren't prepared to die for was an ideology or set of beliefs passed on to them from some political or religious leader. Now, you could say, probably unfairly, later Christian martyrs could possibly fit into that category. However, with Jesus' disciples, it's different. They were prepared to die and did die because they had personally seen Jesus alive after his death. That points clearly to the disciples having actually seen him. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence is the conversion of skeptics. Now, in the early days of Christianity, two of the early leaders of the way, as the early Christians called themselves, were people who'd been unconvinced that Jesus was the Son of God. And the first half we heard about Paul. When he was called Saul, he was a persecutor of Christians. What changed him to being a follower of Jesus was meeting Jesus alive on the road to Damascus sometime after his death. The other former skeptic we know of is James, the brother of Jesus. Now, Jesus wasn't an only child. He had a number of brothers and sisters. His whole family, including his mother, tried to stop him in his mission. In Mark's gospel, his whole family, presumably James included, come to get him. Mark says, when his family heard about this, his teaching that is, they went to take charge of him, for they said he's out of his mind. That's Mark chapter 3, verse 20. James isn't mentioned as a follower of Jesus in the Gospels. Yet in the early church, James is a leading figure. Well, why the change? Well, we're told in Paul's letters that James too had seen Jesus alive after his death. James changed from being a skeptic to a believer after seeing the risen Christ. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence. The way I want to try and explain this, ask yourself the question, why is it there are Jewish people around today? Jews can trace their origins back to the tribal Middle East of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Now, there were other people around at that time. Why is it then there are no people alive today who would call themselves Ammonites or Babylonians or Assyrians or Hittites? The answer is in the social and religious structures that make Jews Jews. Jewish people have lived side by side with non-Jews for the last 2,000 years, but have remained distinctly different because of their own customs, laws, eating habits, religious practices, religious beliefs, and so on. To Jews, these are what make them who they are and are terribly important to them. Now, some have viewed the early Jewish Christians as just another Jewish sect. In a sense, they were. However, they were different from those other sects that existed at that time. Those other sects didn't disagree with the fundamentals of Judaism. Now, the first Christians were all Jews. We've got clear evidence that early after Jesus' death, these Jewish Christians rejected many of the foundations of Judaism. That brought with it an enormous social leap and one that brought with it great personal risk to their lives. We've also evidenced these changes weren't made lightly or easily by the early Jewish Christians. So what were these changes? Well, they stopped offering animal sacrifice. They eventually rejected the belief that keeping Moses' laws, not the Ten Commandments, but the other eating, social, and sacrifice laws that Jews believed was the way to be right with God. They changed their Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. They believed in a Trinity, one God in three forms. That was blasphemy to the Jews. They believed the Messiah had come. The Jews were and are still waiting. And they initiated a new ritual called the Lord's Supper, a ritual that celebrates Jesus' victory over death. Why did the early Jewish Christians make these changes? Well, because their leaders had seen Jesus alive after his death, remembered his teachings, and were therefore compelled to make these changes. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence is the emergence of Christianity. Earlier on this evening, we talked about how quickly, after Jesus' death, Christianity caught hold and spread through the Roman world. Well, why did that happen? Why did it not just disappear like other religious fads we're aware of that existed in the Roman world, which didn't survive? Why didn't Christianity just fizzle out after a few decades? Well, the answer is the resurrection. A core of people witnessed Jesus alive after his death. The sources tell us this. These core of people were transformed from illiterate fishermen, Jewish zealots, tax collectors, and other ordinary people to tireless advocates for the risen Jesus. As we saw earlier, the disciples formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. They did all this because of the resurrection. Without the resurrection, there would have been no lasting Christianity. Frankly, without the resurrection, we wouldn't be here tonight. So, I started this evening making a couple of statements. There's a historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God, and there's a wealth of evidence to support that view. So to end, let's review what we've looked at this evening. Okay, so we stated that the Gospels and most of the letters of Paul are likely to provide an accurate account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. We stated that the view of today's historians is that these documents have been, on the whole, accurately preserved for us and haven't been subject to accidental or deliberate modification. We reviewed the historical information that was contemporary to but out with the Gospels. This provided information that didn't contradict what was in the Gospels and letters of Paul. We presented evidence demonstrating that it was very likely Jesus saw himself as the Son of God. We suggested it was very unlikely that he saw himself that way due to some psychological condition. And we also suggested that when the sources are reviewed, there's no evidence to suggest either Jesus deliberately misled them or unintentionally misled them. We also presented evidence demonstrating it was very likely that Jesus was executed and died. We presented evidence that it was very likely he was buried and that shortly afterwards his tomb was found to be empty. We looked at possible explanations for his tomb being empty. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was his body was no longer on earth. And we looked at the historical basis of Jesus' appearances to the disciples. We found that this is regarded as a secure fact by most historians. And we reviewed what it was the disciples saw. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that the disciples saw, met, talked with, and ate with Jesus in bodily form after his death. Lastly, we looked at circumstantial evidence for the resurrection. We suggested that without the resurrection, it's likely that the disciples wouldn't have died for their beliefs. Skeptics like Paul and James would not have been converted. A clear separation of Jewish Christians and Judaism would not have occurred. The early church would not have emerged and spread so quickly. Christianity would not have lasted to this day. Okay. History is sometimes not an exact discipline. We can rarely say with absolute certainty that something happened in the past at a particular time, or we sometimes have difficulty saying that something happened in the past in a particular time and it happened in a particular way. Even today, with mass communication, controversy can raise relating to events that occurred last week or a few years ago. For example, John F. Kennedy's assassination, Princess Diana's death, and so on. Now, I suppose it's the same with Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. I can't say with absolute certainty that the evidence I presented this evening is 100% correct. I can't say with absolute certainty that Jesus is the Son of God based on this. But I think what I can say is that Jesus being the Son of God is the most likely explanation of the pretty extensive evidence that we've got. What I can say is, looked at rationally, the alternative explanations for the evidence are simply far less likely. Okay, I'm sure some of you will be agreeing with us. I'm also sure that some of you will be thinking, isn't this a bit one-sided? Christian presents evidence for Christianity in church setting. Surely there's another point of view. Frankly, if I'd been sitting where you are when I was an agnostic, I'd be thinking exactly that. However, my spiritual journey didn't end by reading The Case for Christ and a few Christian histories in the life of Jesus. I also trawled bookshops for books on atheism. I felt sure that I'd find some atheistic stuff that would blow all this out the water. I scoured atheist websites. I read detailed hostile reviews, The Case for Christ. I listened to and read articles by atheists. I still do. It's blooming depressing, but there you are. I read the New Testament for myself. I read biographies and critiques of Jesus by non-Christians. I'd also encourage anyone with doubts about the material presented this evening to do exactly the same. And what was the result of all that research? Well, I think I can summarize that by saying I was an agnostic then, I'm a Christian now. Okay, what we haven't discussed this evening is Jesus' message and what it means. What we haven't discussed is why Jesus' message and our relationship with Jesus Christ is important to you today. You may or may not be glad to know I'm not going to start now. However, consider this. If Jesus is real, if Jesus is the Son of God, then his message is real too. In the last 2,000 years, countless lives have been positively transformed by our relationship with Jesus Christ and Jesus' message. And don't kid yourselves, if you truly accept Jesus' message, and I'm stressing the words truly accept, and Jesus' message, it's always a positive transformation. So in conclusion, do you not owe it to yourselves to weigh up the evidence and decide what you think? If you do this and decide that Jesus is real, do you not owe it to yourselves to find out what his message is and start to experience that positive transformation? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to have to sit down and we'll have a Q&A session. But you want to mention your Alpha course?
Yeah.
Right. I'll have Q&A in a minute.
Will do.
First the ad.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very, very much. I know you've come all the way from Glasgow. It's a long way to come and sort us all out in Congleton, but and Butt Lane and Alsager and wherever else we've come from. So we're very, very grateful for you coming. It's blown my mind. I've been a Christian since 1977, and I grew up in church. I think I always just accepted the information we were given in those days. I wasn't an analyst or anything like that, but I found it absolutely amazing and fascinating tonight. I worked in a bank. I became the church treasurer. We had a new fiery Welshman as the vicar. And when I went to get the cheque signed, he said to me, "You're not a real Christian." And I thought, I've been here longer than you. You'd only just arrived. I said, "What do you mean? I've been in this church a lot longer than you." He said, "If you think just going to church makes you a Christian, go home and sleep in your garage and see if you wake up as a motor car." But it challenged me. And then all the information I'd received and what we've received this evening is here in our heads, but it has to move to our hearts. And it's a head-to-heart message as well.
Yeah.
And Derek mentioned about the Alpha course. We run the Alpha course here twice a year. I know there are lots of people from New Life Church who are here. He's covering his mouth up now, Steve Turner, who've been on the Alpha course. And that's where we learn not just the information, but where it comes from our heads to our hearts.
Yeah.
And we run it twice a year. We're halfway through our current Alpha course, but if you really want to make that decision, want to come to that living faith, and you're not yet there, well, I don't want you to miss out, because when you leave this earth, right, I want you all to go to heaven, to be with me when I get there. You'll find me there putting the chairs out and doing all sorts of things like that, organising the bar and everything. But I do hope and pray that we all make it. And it needs all this wonderful information, and the truth moves from our heads to our hearts. And I pray that if you want to join the Alpha course, if you come on Wednesday morning, 9:30, Wednesday evening, about 6:45, 10 to 7, you get fed, lovely meal. Do come. You're very, very welcome. or you want to talk to us afterwards, talk to Derek. He's not going to Glasgow till tomorrow morning. He's staying at my house. If you want to come to my house later and keep us up till midnight,
Fine.
we don't mind, do we?
Yeah, not at all.
Not at all. As long as I've got him on the road in the morning, he'll be all right. So thank you so very much for coming. I just pray and commend to you this wonderful good news of Jesus.
Aye.
It transforms your life. It makes your life purposeful. It gives you, it's just so wonderful. I can't say how wonderful it is. When I became a Christian, I told all my friends, I thought they'd all want to be Christians. Why would they want to miss out on something? The only thing was, they didn't really want me then. Now one or two are now becoming Christians, which is good news. So don't miss out, everybody. I want to see you all in heaven one day. Not yet. Lots of time for us on this earth yet to make the most of it. But thank you for coming. Thank you for taking part. And thank you, Derek. And he's going to ask you any questions now. Is that right?
Okay.
Anybody? I'll
Got
hand
any
you back to
questions,
Derek.
anybody? Right. So I can see. Anybody get any questions? Yes. I'm looking at you, aye.
I don't want to challenge this.
No, it's all right.
I don't want to challenge what you've been saying at all. Just to say that before I speak.
Okay.
But I'm also... Well, before I speak... Sorry, I don't know where that came from. I'm a bit curious about the proliferation of messiahs in the Holy Land at this time.
Yeah.
Because we're not mentioned that, really.
Well, I mean, yeah, there were people that claimed...
I once worked with a Jewish man
Yep.
who saw this as a major reason why we shouldn't take Jesus Christ seriously.
Well, they
there
had...
were loads of them.
Well, okay, right.
And I couldn't answer.
Okay, I'll try my best to answer that. Yes, you're right. There were other people that claimed to be the anointed one. Yeah. But they were quickly dealt with, and they didn't get a following on from... We hear about them we can read about them in history sources, but we don't know really anything about them. Why do we not know anything about them? Because Jesus is unique insofar as he was resurrected. That's why we're here tonight. If he wasn't resurrected, it'd have been just another bloke that was claiming to be a Messiah who was quickly dealt with before he could cause any real trouble, like all the other ones. The Egyptian was one of them. A fella called the Egyptian is mentioned in the Gospels, and so I think the letters of Acts and the Apostles. And there were various people that claimed to be the Messiah, but only Jesus resurrected, and so that's why we follow him.
And the miracle of Jesus is the sheer numbers of people who believed in him. When there were lots of
indeed,
competing people at the time.
Yes.
Who might have emerged in a similar way, but never did.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
I believe there's some people who claim to be Elvis Presley. They're not.
Anybody else?
More questions?
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll ask myself a question and get things moving. I'm very often asked, it's not there anymore. The presentation, was that what made you a Christian? The answer to that is yes and no. I guess this got me into a position where I could consider the possibility of a relationship with Jesus Christ. Yeah. Prior to that, I just wouldn't have a possibility. That wouldn't occur to me as a possibility. And don't go away. You'll get a couple of booklets.
Hang on. Run down.
Don't go away without booklets. I've got millions of them here. Anyway, so I guess
just hang on.
This got me to a position where I could consider the possibility of a relationship. And what I had to do was make, as Steve said, the step of faith to give myself over to Jesus Christ. And my life was transformed. I know plenty of people here will know exactly what I'm talking about. When you let Jesus into your life transforms. I was an angry workaholic, and the result of having Christianity or Jesus in my life was my relationships with my kids improved, my relationship with my wife improved, my temper improved. I've still got a wee bit of a temper, but, I recognize it for what it is these days. So I've had my life transformed. I can guarantee you will have your life transformed in a good way.
Thank you.
Anyway, right, that's that question answered.
Let me get to you need to get to the door. I don't want them to miss out. I don't want to be left with thousands of booklets either.
There you go. No bother. You're free to go.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for coming.
Okay, any other question? Come on. Yeah.